Ever wonder what happens when a Karen mistakes for sale signs for free candy announcements? Smash that like button if you've ever dealt with someone who thinks your property comes with a complimentary deed transfer. And drop a comment about the most ridiculous thing a stranger has ever demanded from you. 3 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's cabin in the Colorado Rockies. Picture this: 1,200 square feet of rustic heaven perched on a cliff overlooking Pine Lake, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and the occasional curious deer. Grandpa built it himself in 1987 with his bare hands and enough bourbon to fuel a small town. The place had everything: a stone fireplace that could roast a small buffalo, a wraparound deck perfect for morning coffee and evening whiskey, and most importantly, 0 neighbors within shouting distance. Or so I thought. I'd been spending weekends there, fixing up the place and enjoying what I foolishly believed was peaceful solitude. The cabin needed work: new shingles, updated plumbing, and a deck railing that wouldn't collapse if you leaned on it too enthusiastically. But it was mine, legally and morally, with a deed older than most of the trees surrounding it. That's when I met Margaret. Margaret was what you'd get if you crossed a real estate shark with a helicopter parent and sprinkled in just enough entitlement to make your teeth ache. She appeared on a Tuesday morning like a bad omen in designer hiking boots, marching up my mountain path with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in her entire pampered existence. "Excuse me," she called out, waving at me like I was a wayward taxi. I was on the deck, installing new railings and minding my own damn business. "Are you the owner of this structure?" "Structure?" She said it the way most people say sewage treatment plant. "That would be me," I replied, not bothering to climb down. Something about her tone already had my sarcasm sensors tingling. "Perfect. I'm Margaret Whitfield." She announced this like I should immediately drop to my knees in gratitude. "I own the luxury resort development down the mountain, Whitfield Wilderness Retreat." I'd heard of it. A glorified glamping site where city folk paid premium prices to experience authentic mountain life while enjoying heated bathroom floors and complimentary champagne service. The kind of place where people Instagram their roughing it experience between spa appointments. "Congratulations," I said, returning to my drilling. "Want a cookie?" She didn't appreciate my enthusiasm. "I'm here to make you an offer you can't refuse." I paused. "Are you about to quote The Godfather while wearing REI gear? Because that's a new level of suburban intimidation I'm not prepared for." Her smile tightened like a yoga mat being rolled up by someone with anger issues. "This property would be perfect for expanding my resort. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000. I nearly dropped my drill. Not from excitement, from pure, unadulterated disbelief. The land alone was worth 10 times that, and she knew it. $50,000, I repeated slowly, like I was trying to process quantum physics. For a mountain property with lake access, it's a generous offer considering the condition of the building. I looked at my cabin: solid log construction, new roof, foundation that had weathered 37 winters without so much as a crack. Then I looked at Margaret, who was eyeing my property like a lion sizing up a particularly slow gazelle. "Thanks, but I'll pass," I said. "I'm kind of attached to it. Call it sentimental value." The temperature on the deck seemed to drop about 20 degrees, and it wasn't because of the altitude. "I don't think you understand," Margaret said, her voice taking on that special tone reserved for explaining things to particularly dense children. "This offer won't be available indefinitely. Properties like this, well, let's just say accidents happen in the mountains." And there it was, my first taste of Margaret's particular brand of charm. Vague threats wrapped in a smile faker than her Louis Vuitton hiking boots. "Are you threatening my cabin?" I asked, leaning against the railing I'd just finished installing. Because that sounded suspiciously like threatening my cabin. "Of course not. I'm simply pointing out that mountain properties require maintenance that can be quite expensive for a single owner." "Right." And I'm sure her concern for my financial well-being was purely altruistic. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some maintaining to do." She stood there for another minute, probably waiting for me to change my mind and throw myself at her feet in gratitude. When that didn't happen, she turned on her designer heel and marched back down the path, muttering something that sounded distinctly uncomplimentary. I should have known that wouldn't be the end of it. In my experience, entitled people treat no the same way vampires treat holy water. It just makes them angrier and more determined. But hey, at least I'd gotten a good story out of it. Or so I thought. Little did I know, Margaret was just getting warmed up. 2 weeks after Margaret's charming visit, my peaceful mountain retreat turned into what I can only describe as a low-budget psychological thriller directed by someone with serious boundary issues. It started small, as these things usually do. A few hikers accidentally wandering onto my property, peering through windows and taking photos. When I approached them, they'd claim to be lost, which is impressive considering my cabin sits at the end of a clearly marked private road with enough no trespassing signs to decorate a small Christmas tree. "We're just admiring the view," said one particularly bold specimen, a woman in pristine hiking gear that screamed, "I bought this outfit yesterday." She was standing on my deck, for crying out loud, photographing my living room through the window. "The view's over there." I pointed toward the lake, on public land. "This is private property." "Oh, we didn't realize." She gave me a smile that could have powered a small city with its sheer artificial wattage. "We're staying at Whitfield Wilderness Retreat. Margaret mentioned there might be some beautiful photo opportunities up here." Of course she did. After the third group of lost hikers in 2 days, I invested in a rather pointed sign. "Private property. Trespassers will be used as bear bait." It seemed to reduce the foot traffic considerably. But Margaret wasn't done. Oh no, she was just getting creative. The next phase of her charm offensive involved the local authorities. Apparently, my cabin was suddenly a hotbed of suspicious activity. I learned this when Deputy Johnson showed up on a Thursday afternoon, looking like a man who'd drawn the short straw for dealing with frivolous complaints. "Sorry to bother you," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through graying hair. "Got a call about possible illegal construction up here." I gestured to my clearly legal cabin with its clearly legal permits posted in the clearly legal window. "What construction would that be, Deputy?" "Caller said you were building without permits. Adding structures, that sort of thing." "You mean the deck railing I replaced? The one that was rotting and definitely qualified as a safety hazard?" Deputy Johnson looked at the railing, then at the permits, then sighed like a man reconsidering his career choices. "Mind if I take a look around? Just to cover my bases." "Knock yourself out." He spent 10 minutes examining my grandfather's handiwork, occasionally nodding and making notes. Finally, he tucked his notebook away and shook his head. "Everything looks legitimate. Sorry for the trouble. Between you and me," he lowered his voice conspiratorially, "this is the third property complaint we've gotten about this area this month. All from the same caller. Let me guess, Margaret Whitfield?" His expression said everything his professional discretion wouldn't let him voice out loud. After he left, I sat on my newly legal deck and pondered the situation. Margaret had apparently decided that if she couldn't buy my property, she'd make owning it as miserable as possible. It was like dealing with a toddler who discovered the power of tantrums, except this toddler had money and a real estate license. The harassment escalated over the next few weeks. Suddenly, my power company needed to inspect my connections 3 times in 2 weeks. My internet provider received anonymous complaints about illegal installations. Someone called the Forestry Service claiming I was cutting down protected trees. I trimmed exactly 1 dead branch that was threatening my roof. Each visit followed the same pattern. An apologetic official, a brief inspection, a finding of no violations, and a weary admission that yes, they'd been getting a lot of calls about this particular property lately. "Ma'am," I told the third power company inspector, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but unless my cabin has achieved sentience and started filing complaints about itself, someone is wasting a lot of people's time here." She laughed despite herself. "Between you and me, we're considering charging a fee for repeated false reports. This is getting ridiculous." That gave me an idea. I started documenting everything. Every lost hiker, every unnecessary inspection, every mysterious phone call to various agencies. I set up a trail camera aimed at the path to catch the trespassers in action. The footage was better than Netflix. Grown adults pretending to be lost while obviously following GPS coordinates directly to my property. My personal favorite was a man who claimed to be bird watching while standing on my porch with a measuring tape. Fascinating birds, I said, stepping out of the cabin. What species are you tracking? He froze like a deer in headlights. Measuring tape still extended. Woodpeckers. With a measuring tape? Very precise woodpeckers? I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But the piece de resistance came 3 weeks later, when Margaret decided to escalate from petty harassment to outright intimidation. I was inside working on replacing some old window frames when I heard vehicles pulling up outside. Not just one vehicle, multiple vehicles. I looked out to see a convoy that would have made a military operation proud. Margaret's pristine white SUV, followed by 2 pickup trucks full of what I can only describe as hired muscle and flannel. 6 guys who looked like they'd been ordered from a catalog titled Generic Mountain Men for Intimidating Purposes. Margaret emerged from her SUV like a general surveying a battlefield, while her flannel army arranged themselves in what I assumed they thought was a threatening formation. They looked like a boy band audition gone horribly wrong. This was going to be interesting. Margaret's intimidation squad clustered around her SUV like confused bodyguards at a yoga retreat, clearly unsure about their role in whatever drama was about to unfold. Margaret herself stood in front of my cabin with the posture of Napoleon reviewing troops. If Napoleon had worn designer hiking boots and carried a Louis Vuitton purse. I stepped onto my deck, coffee mug in hand, and surveyed the scene. Morning, Margaret. Nice entourage. Are you starting a lumberjack boy band? Or is this a hostile takeover? Her face flushed the color of overripe tomatoes. This is your last chance to be reasonable. Reasonable? I took a leisurely sip of coffee. You mean like bringing 6 guys to threaten a woman on her own property? That kind of reasonable. One of her flannel warriors shifted uncomfortably. They clearly hadn't signed up for whatever this was turning into. Good. Nothing deflates manufactured intimidation quite like obvious discomfort from the intimidators. I'm prepared to increase my offer, Margaret announced, like she was bestowing a great honor upon me. $75,000. Final offer. The audacity was breathtaking. She'd brought what appeared to be a small militia to pressure me into selling my property for about 1/10 of its value. It was like watching someone try to buy a Ferrari with Monopoly money while holding a water gun. Still not interested, I said. But I appreciate the theater. Did you rent these guys by the hour? The largest of her hired help, a bearded giant who looked like he could bench press a small car, actually snorted with laughter before catching himself. Margaret shot him a look that could have flash-frozen hell. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice taking on that special tone people use when they're about to say something they'll regret. This mountain isn't safe for a woman living alone. Accidents happen. Equipment fails. Help is very far away. And there it was, the threat I'd been expecting since day one, delivered with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. Are you threatening me, Margaret? I asked, loud enough for her entire crew to hear clearly, because that sounded an awful lot like a threat. I'm simply pointing out the dangers of mountain living, she replied, but her voice had gone up an octave. Remote locations, harsh weather, mechanical failures. Flannel-wearing trespassers, I added helpfully. Don't forget those. 2 of her guys exchanged glances. Even hired muscle has standards, apparently. Look, lady, said the bearded giant, addressing Margaret. I thought we were here to make an offer, not whatever this is. Margaret's carefully constructed authority crumbled like a stale cookie. I'm paying you to stand around looking intimidating, he interrupted. Not to threaten people. There's a difference. I raised my coffee mug in a mock toast. I like him. He has principles. The situation was deteriorating rapidly from Margaret's perspective. Her hired intimidation was developing consciences. Her threats were being recorded by my strategically placed trail camera, and I was treating the whole thing like dinner theater. Fine, she snapped. If you won't listen to reason, maybe you'll listen to the authorities. She pulled out her phone with a flourish and dialed 911. Right there, in front of everyone. While trespassing on my property with 6 guys, she'd essentially admitted to hiring for intimidation purposes. 911. I need to report a dangerous situation. There's an unstable woman threatening people with a weapon at. She rattled off my address. I nearly choked on my coffee. A weapon? What weapon? She pointed at my coffee mug. I'm not kidding. She pointed at my ceramic coffee mug, the one with a faded world's best grandpa logo that my grandfather had used for 30 years, and told emergency dispatch I was threatening people with it. Ma'am, said the bearded giant, that's a coffee cup. It could be thrown. Margaret insisted. She's acting erratically. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. Margaret was standing on my property with 6 hired guys, making veiled threats about accidents and equipment failures, while claiming I was the dangerous one because I was holding breakfast. You know what? I said to the group at large. I think we should wait right here for the police. This should be educational for everyone involved. Margaret's face went through several interesting color changes as she realized what she'd just done. She'd called the police on herself, essentially, while committing multiple misdemeanors in front of witnesses and a camera. On second thought, she said quickly, maybe we should. Oh no, I interrupted, settling into my deck chair. You called 911. They're coming. It would be rude to leave now. The next 20 minutes were like watching a slow-motion car crash performed by people who'd forgotten they were driving. Margaret tried to dismiss her flannel army. Just go. I'll handle this. But they seemed reluctant to abandon her to face the consequences of her own stupidity. Meanwhile, she kept trying to coach me on what to tell the police, apparently not realizing that everything she was saying was making her situation worse. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding, she pleaded. It was, I agreed. You misunderstood the concepts of private property, legal threats, and appropriate use of emergency services. When Deputy Johnson arrived, the same deputy who'd been dealing with Margaret's harassment campaign, his expression suggested he was reconsidering not just his career choice, but possibly his entire life path. He stepped out of his patrol car, surveyed the scene, 1 woman with coffee, 6 uncomfortable-looking guys, and Margaret having what appeared to be a minor breakdown, and sighed deeply. Let me guess, he said to me. Another complaint from Ms. Whitfield? Actually, I said. This time she called you herself. Something about me threatening people with breakfast. Deputy Johnson looked at my coffee mug, looked at Margaret, looked at the small army she'd brought to intimidate me, and pulled out his notebook with the enthusiasm of someone about to perform root canal surgery on himself. This was about to get very interesting for Margaret. Deputy Johnson's questioning process was like watching a masterclass in professional patience. He started with Margaret, who immediately launched into a dramatic account of my threatening behavior that would have made Shakespeare proud of its creative fiction. She was waving that mug around menacingly. Margaret insisted, gesturing wildly at my decidedly non-menacing grandfather's coffee cup. Uh-huh, Deputy Johnson said, scribbling notes. And you felt threatened enough to bring. He counted Margaret's flannel army. 6 men to this confrontation? You could actually see the moment Margaret realized she'd painted herself into a corner. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish trying to explain quantum physics. They're not. I mean, they were just. She turned to her hired help for support, but they were suddenly very interested in examining their boots. Actually, said the bearded giant, addressing Deputy Johnson, I think there's been some confusion about why we're here. I'm listening, the deputy said. What followed was beautiful in its simplicity. Turned out, Margaret had hired these guys from a local moving company, telling them she needed help securing a property purchase. They thought they were there to help load furniture, not intimidate someone into selling. She said the lady was expecting us, explained another guy. Said it was all arranged, we just needed to look official to help close the deal. Margaret's face went through the entire spectrum of human emotion, landing somewhere between deer in headlights and, oh shit, I'm about to be arrested. Deputy Johnson turned to me. And your version of events? I handed him my phone with the trail camera footage queued up. This should cover most of it. Plus whatever your body cam picked up when you arrived. He watched the footage, Margaret making threats, bringing intimidation crew, calling 911 about my dangerous coffee mug, while Margaret stood there looking like she was watching her own funeral. "Ms. Whitfield," Deputy Johnson said finally, "I'm going to need you to come with me." "What? What?" He started ticking off charges on his fingers like he was reading a grocery list. Criminal trespass, harassment, filing a false police report, conspiracy to intimidate, and we might throw in fraud for lying to those gentlemen about why you hired them. The moving crew guys looked relieved. They shook hands with me, apologized for the confusion, and left faster than tourists fleeing a bear sighting. Smart men. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed to be having some kind of existential crisis. "This is ridiculous. I was just trying to buy property." "With threats and intimidation?" Deputy Johnson asked mildly. "Ma'am, that's not how real estate works. That's how extortion works." As Margaret was being loaded into the patrol car, still protesting her innocence to anyone who'd listen, Deputy Johnson handed me a business card. "Restraining order," he said simply. "Get one. Also, that trail camera footage? Keep copies. Something tells me this isn't over." He was right, of course. Margaret made bail the same day, and apparently decided that if legal intimidation wouldn't work, she'd try the court of public opinion. By evening, my phone was buzzing with notifications. Margaret had posted on every local Facebook group, Nextdoor, and community forum she could find, spinning a tale of woe that would have made Victorian novelists weep with envy. According to Margaret's version of events, I was a dangerous squatter who'd illegally occupied a property that rightfully belonged to the community. She'd bravely tried to negotiate with me, only to be threatened with violence by a clearly unhinged woman wielding deadly breakfast beverages. The posts included photos of my cabin, taken during her various trespassing expeditions, and a detailed explanation of how my presence was destroying the natural beauty and harmony of the mountain community. It was masterful fiction. Too bad for Margaret that several people in those same Facebook groups had witnessed her harassment campaign firsthand, and others had been dealing with her development's environmental violations for months. The comment sections turned into digital bloodbaths. Neighbors who'd been dealing with Margaret's entitled behavior for years came out of the woodwork like termites after rain. Story after story of her trying to buy out long-term residents, filing frivolous complaints, and generally making everyone's life miserable in service of expanding her resort empire. My personal favorite comment came from a woman named Janet. "Margaret tried to buy my family's ranch last year. When we said no, she somehow got the health department to inspect our well water 6 times in 2 months. All tests came back perfect, but she kept calling in concerns about contamination. Ladies got more red flags than a Soviet parade." By midnight, Margaret's posts had been deleted, her social media accounts were locked, and she'd apparently hired a PR company to manage what they probably euphemistically called her reputation challenges. But Margaret wasn't done yet. When public shaming failed, she decided to escalate to what I can only describe as psychological warfare with a budget that suggested she'd watched too many stalker movies. The next morning, I found a surveyor on my property. Not a legitimate surveyor. This guy was clearly from some discount service, and he was measuring my property lines with equipment that looked like it came from a cereal box. "Can I help you?" I asked, stepping outside with my apparently threatening coffee mug. "Survey," he grunted, not looking up from his toy-grade equipment. "Checking property boundaries." "On whose authority?" He handed me a crumpled paper that claimed Margaret had concerns about encroachment and needed an official survey. The document looked about as legitimate as a $3 bill, but the surveyor seemed convinced he was doing important work. I called Deputy Johnson, who arrived just as the fake surveyor was trying to plant a boundary marker in what was clearly the middle of my property. "Sir," Deputy Johnson said wearily, "do you have a license for surveying in this county?" The man's expression suggested that licensing was a concept he'd never encountered. Turns out, Margaret had hired him from Craigslist and told him it was all perfectly legal. Another fraud charge for Margaret's growing collection. But the real fun started that evening, when Margaret decided to play her final card. If she couldn't have my property, she'd make sure I couldn't enjoy it either. That's when the real war began. Margaret's last gambit was so spectacularly stupid that I almost felt bad for her. Almost. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of chainsaws. Not the distant, reasonable sound of forestry work, but the aggressive, way too close sound of someone cutting down trees on my property. I threw on clothes and ran outside to find 3 guys with chainsaws merrily destroying the beautiful pine trees that border my cabin. They'd already felled 2 mature trees and were working on a 3rd. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed over the noise. The lead chainsaw guy shut off his saw and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Tree removal, ma'am. Safety hazard." "Says who?" He pulled out a work order signed by Margaret Whitfield, claiming the trees posed an imminent danger to nearby structures and needed immediate removal. The document looked official enough to fool someone who didn't know that Margaret had exactly 0 authority to order tree removal on anyone else's property. "These are my trees," I said slowly, "on my property." The chainsaw crew exchanged glances that said they were beginning to suspect they'd been had. Again, "Lady said she owned this land," the lead guy said defensively. "Lady lied. Also, Lady is currently facing criminal charges for the last time she lied about owning this land." I called Deputy Johnson for what felt like the 100th time in 2 weeks. While waiting for him to arrive, I documented everything. The fallen trees, the fake work order, the crew's admission that Margaret had hired them. But here's where Margaret's plan truly backfired. Those pine trees she'd ordered cut down, they were over 100 years old and protected under state environmental laws. Cutting them down without permits wasn't just trespassing and vandalism. It was an environmental crime with serious federal implications. When Deputy Johnson arrived with a state environmental officer in tow, Margaret's legal troubles multiplied like rabbits in spring. The environmental officer took one look at the fallen trees and called in a full investigation team. "Ma'am," he told me gravely, "these trees are protected old-growth specimens. Their destruction carries significant criminal and civil penalties." The chainsaw crew was more than happy to testify about who hired them and what instructions they'd been given. Margaret had apparently told them the trees were diseased and needed immediate removal to prevent contamination. All 3 trees were perfectly healthy, as any actual arborist could have told her. While the environmental team processed the scene like CSI, Forest Edition, I decided it was time to end Margaret's harassment campaign permanently. I called the best environmental lawyer in the state and explained the situation. "Oh, this is good," the lawyer said after reviewing my documentation. "This is very, very good. How do you feel about turning this into an object lesson about property rights and environmental protection?" 3 days later, Margaret found herself facing a lawsuit that read like a greatest hits album of bad decisions. Criminal trespass, harassment, filing false reports, fraud, conspiracy, environmental destruction, and my personal favorite, intentional infliction of emotional distress through coordinated stalking behavior. The environmental fines alone were enough to make her resort development unprofitable for the next decade. But the real beauty was in the civil suit, which included damages for the destroyed trees. Apparently, century-old protected pines have replacement values that would make your eyes water, legal costs, and punitive damages for the systematic harassment campaign. Margaret tried to settle out of court within a week. My lawyer's response was essentially absolutely not, with more legal terminology. The trial was everything I'd hoped for and more. Margaret's defense strategy seemed to be deny everything while accidentally confessing to everything. Her lawyer looked like a man who'd drawn the short straw in the office's worst client lottery. The judge listened to 3 days of testimony about fake surveyors, hired intimidation crews, environmental destruction, and threatening coffee mugs before delivering a verdict that was both legally thorough and personally satisfying. Margaret was ordered to pay $350,000 in damages and fines, sentenced to 200 hours of community service, specifically environmental restoration work, and granted a permanent restraining order that banned her from coming within 1,000 feet of my property. But the real victory came 6 months later, when Margaret's resort went bankrupt from legal costs and environmental violations. The property was sold to the state and turned into a protected wildlife preserve. I'm still in my cabin, by the way. I've added a deck extension and a hot tub, funded partly by Margaret's generous settlement contribution, to my home improvement fund. The environmental restoration work has attracted deer, elk, and even a family of black bears who seem to appreciate the peaceful atmosphere. Margaret moved to Florida, where I hear she's trying to convince retirees to sell their condos so she can build a luxury wellness retreat. Some people never learn. I kept the trail camera footage, though. Sometimes, when I need a good laugh, I watch Margaret explaining to a judge why she thought my coffee mug was a deadly weapon. It never gets old. The moral of the story? If someone won't sell you their property, the solution isn't to harass them into submission. It's to accept that no means no and find another property that's actually for sale. But then again, that would require common sense, and Margaret demonstrated conclusively that common sense and entitled behavior are mutually exclusive concepts. These days, I enjoy my coffee on the deck every morning, watching the sunrise over Pine Lake and listening to the sound of absolutely no chainsaws cutting down my trees. It's paradise, and it's mine, and no amount of designer hiking boots and fake authority is going to change that. Sometimes I still get letters from Margaret's lawyers, asking if I'd reconsider selling. I have a standard response now. A photo of my coffee mug with a note saying, "Still threatening people with breakfast. Property still not for sale." I'm pretty sure they're not amused, but frankly, that's not my problem anymore. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.